Welcome to 2024 and to our very first coffee episode of this year. I'm Salma Uche Okeke. Our guest today is Prince Olasehinde Odimayo, an accomplished art consultant specializing in traditional, modern, and contemporary Nigerian art. As a trustee of the Visual Arts Society of Nigeria, VASCO, and the director of Treasure House Fine Arts, a leading gallery in Nigeria, Odimayo brings a unique perspective to the intersection of art and culture. With a background in German studies and fine art appraisal at Sotheby's Institute in London, he has blended his artistic passion with a deep understanding of the art market. Apart from his contributions to the art world, Odimayo holds a special place in royalty, becoming a prince through his father's appointment as a ruler in Irele and Jabo in 1978. Through his friendship with Ijoma Uche Okeke and our family, he holds a special place in our hearts, the hearts of the Uche Okeke legacy, and it is my delight to welcome him to our podcast today. Also to welcome my co-host, Tamzin. Lovell.
Thank you, Salma. I'm excited about meeting Prince Odimayo today and having the opportunity to delve into his artistic journey, his role in shaping the Nigerian art scene, and his insights on preserving and carrying forward the legacies of great artists like Uche Okeke for future generations. Prince Odimayo, your journey as an artist started at a very young age. Could you share with us some early experiences or influences that shaped your passion for art?
Thank you very much. There are three sources that I am conscious of today. The first one was when I was a little child, probably before the age of 5. And I got to know this from an older brother who was a major collector of traditional Nigerian art. And I helped him to build his collection over a period of years. And we had many discussions together on and off, discussing art, especially traditional Nigerian art or traditional African art. And one occasion, he alluded to the fact that I had gone to him and I gave him the impression that my early connection with visual art had to do with when I was carving models of boats or launches, which our late father imported from England in the 1950s, about 1954 and 55. I told him that I thought that was my early stirrings with visual arts. I used to carve, I know maybe about the 1960s or so. I will carve models of these two boats or launches, and they were passenger boats, and they used to travel between Lagos and the Delta states and our own area, which is Ikale land, somewhere in Ondo State. I will carve the models, and the two launches were named Olaoluwa, which in Yoruba means the grace of the Almighty. And then the second boat launch was named Lady Soyinka, after Wale Soyinka's mother, who was a family friend to our family at that time. And I used to put those boats in water after carving them in containers or basins, and we'll toy with them, move them around. And my late brother told me that wasn't the beginning. And he said, look, when you are very small, maybe between 3, 4, and 5, that you used to collect shoe boxes from people who bought new shoes in the house, in our home at that time. And you will make paper boats and store the paper boats in the boxes. And then he also said, our father was also at the same time also a timber merchant. And he used to maintain the lorries with which timber was moved from the interior of the so-called Western region at that time to Lagos before they were shipped abroad, mainly to England at that time. And he said, I will go into the maintenance yard, collect bolts and nuts and spare parts, and put them in a second shoebox. And he said, I will store the paper boats as well as the bolts and nuts in 2 different boxes. And that whenever I finish making the boats and it rained, that I'll go to outside the house, which was somewhere in downtown Lagos at that time, and that I'll go to outside and drop each of the boats in the drain, and I'll stay there outside until the boats disappeared into the horizon. And then he also said that those two boxes, that it was difficult for anybody in the house to persuade me to leave those boxes, and that I will carry those boxes all over the house until I was tired and slept off. That was what he told me at that time. And the second source, again, which is a recollection from an older sister who has since passed away, and a schoolmate of mine in the elementary school at that time, was that we had Aina Nobolu, the first formally trained Nigerian artist who lived between 1882 and 1963. Aina Nobolu was the first portrait artist in Nigeria and also art teacher in Nigeria. And he was an itinerary art teacher because Lagos was still small in those days. And Aina Nobolu went about from school to teach drawing at that time. And my late sister told me, to my dismay, that he used to come to our school, which was government demonstration school, and he would come around and teach us how to draw. And I didn't believe my sister, my late sister at that time, and because she was very clear that we had Onobolu as our art teacher at that time. Then in 2022, an old schoolmate of mine by the name Okonlawon Beckley, who lives in California right now, who also is an artist, a professional artist in his own right today, also confirmed what my sister had told me, that Aina Nobolu was actually our art teacher, and that whenever he came to teach, that whenever we finished the drawing lessons, as it was called at that time, he said I was usually very elated and excited. And I was not only pleased with whatever I had drawn, but that I had a habit of going around to see what other class highly.
I love it. I love the connection to your father and then the kind of continued experimentation and curiosity. It was obviously a burning force in your life from such a young age.
It's really interesting that from such a young age, he had already started forming these interests in creativity. Mr. Odimayo, your fascination with boats, for instance, do you have any recollection of the root of that?
We come from the southern senatorial district of Ondo State, which is basically the riverine part of Ondo State. And whereas the people in that area, they're basically called the Kale people and the Ilaje people. We're kith and kin. Because of that, I have always been fascinated by water. And we used to have, where I come from, it's a network of rivers, which actually form part of the so-called Niger Delta. And some of the creeks, they lead all the way from Lagos Lagoon, all the way through creeks, various creeks and rivers, up to our own place called Okitukupo. And I think my father then, he knowing fully well that he went into transportation, both land as well as water transportation in the 50s. And he was one of the people in our area who had this transport business, both for water, moving people through the creeks from Lagos to Sapele, Warri, and our place in Okitukupa. And then also had lorries with which he moved passengers on land through narrow colonial roads at that time, from our area, Ikale land, up to Lagos. This was between 1954, 1955, and to about the mid-1960s. And up to today, water fascinates me a lot.
It's really amazing because if you remember, Prince Dimas Nwoko launched some books, and one of it is The Little Prince. And there he also chronicled how he started off in this journey of creativity as a boy. I also note how much the environment affected his journey as it has you. So it's really interesting that as young as people may be, their environment really impacts on them, and that a lot of it affects their artistic journey and creativity. And I wanted to also ask you, as an art consultant in traditional, modern, and contemporary Nigerian art, what challenges and opportunities do you encounter?
My first contact with visual art was about 1982. And that was when I met late David Dill, one of the later generation of Zaria artists. After the so-called Zaria rebels, to which your father and his co-travelers belonged to at that time, the Masuoko, Chie Fashui, and so on and so forth. And David Dill was the first person whose works I collected at that time. And invariably, one will go on to collect other artists' work. But what was happening? By 1982, the art scene in Nigeria was dull. It was totally in doldrums when I got involved. And I got involved with a friend of mine called Folabi Kofu-Abayomi. Both of us were working with corporate entities at that time. And when we got involved, there was nothing happening on the art scene at that time. The few galleries that existed, before in the early 80s or so, were very few and far in between. And they weren't doing much. So the artists didn't have anybody as such to promote their works. And from that moment, my interest got more intense with time in the 80s. And one was still working with, in the corporate world at that time. But both of us realized that the artists were meeting at that time. They didn't know what to do with their works. And we were working in the corporate sector, where also people didn't know anything about visual art at that time. The people who had collected Nigerian contemporary and modern works at that time were who worked in Nigeria during the colonial times and shortly after independence in 1960. So both of us discovered a kind of tabula rasa, totally clean slate. And we, as a hobby or an interest, we developed more interest. We started going around to meet the artists at that time. On Fridays, we'll close early at work. We'll throw away our jackets and hop into one car and visit the artists in their various studios. People like Bruce Onobrakwe, Kolade Oshinowo, David Dill, as I've mentioned earlier on, and the others as well. And that's how we got involved. When we got involved, there was nothing happening at all. There were no exhibitions whatsoever. There were no structures, no galleries. And before I then had a salon exhibition in April 1989. And I think that was the moment we got launched into the art scene fully. And from that moment, from April 1989, one would say that the movement started. And that movement is still up to today, about 40 years in the making. It was a situation when individuals who were deeply passionate about what was happening at that time just came in, developed interest, and everybody went on to establish galleries. Some of those galleries are still operating up till today. People like galleries like My Dream Gallery, Nature Gallery, and so on and so forth. That was the way we all started. We started blank. There was nothing. Everything we developed at various stages.
I get a real sense of the interconnectedness of those that yourself and the artists and the other players that were curious and serious about art at that time. You kind of got together, which is quite amazing, and bounced ideas off each other and developed. You spoke about that word. We developed things and developed together, developed ideas, but also developed yourselves. I love that story about your early days as a young boy being taught to draw, but that curiosity to learn and keep learning is a feature of your life. You completed courses in fine art appraisal and evaluation at Sotheby's in London. And I'm curious what insights you might be able to share from that experience.
It was a master's exhibition during which works of Benenwong, Yusuf Grillo, late Shino Yusuf, Kolade Oshinowo were featured. It was very rare at that time. It wasn't something that was happening regularly. I visited that exhibition with my late brother, and my late brother bought all the Benenwong's works that were on offer at that show. And the organizer of that show, one Mrs. Susan Craig, who at that time was an interior decorator, also an African American, was the one who put the show together. And she curiously asked myself and my late brother, since my late brother had bought so many works from that show, including works by Prince Olasehinde and Kolade Oshinowo. She was very curious and that she was ready to introduce us to Le Benewon to meet him, which was very strange for an art promoter who should have protected clients or patrons from meeting the artist. But she was so excited and she wanted, because of the value of works that my late brother, to introduce us to him. And that was how we met. My late brother and I were introduced to Le Benewon by Susan Craig. I'm not sure where Susan Craig is anymore. I'm not sure whether she went back to America or is still in Nigeria. And that was how we met Benewon. And like I was sharing with Salma a few hours ago, when Benewon came back to Nigeria in 1948, after finishing his art studies in England at Oxford University at that time, Benewon never had anybody working with him as an agent or gallery owner. He would work ad hoc with anybody at that time. And curiously, at that time, he had his works displayed at Quintessence, one of the galleries that are still operating in Nigeria at this moment. And meeting Benewon, who, of course, also a PhD in anthropology, at that time was being thrown at the deep end of a pool. And I realized that if I had to get more interested in the art business at that time, that I needed to educate myself properly. I felt very, very inadequate at that moment. And one who immediately had a liking for myself and my late brother, because I think he thought, both of us coming from the corporate world, we were people he could relate to. And we were not really going after his works as such, but he just realized that we were deeply interested. So I realized personally that I was not adequate. And at that point in time, my late brother also had dealings with Sotheby's in England. He was buying and selling European works at Sotheby's at that time, Bonhams and also Phillips. I then used my brother's connection with Sotheby's to gain admission into Sotheby's Educational Studies in London at that time, in 1991. And I did a crash program in Styles in Art for about 3 or 4 months in England. And before I came back home, after 4 months, I bought a lot of books on visual art and the business of art. When I was in Sotheby's for that course, the teachers, as well as the staff, they were very curious about my presence because they said it was the first time they were seeing a Black person coming from Africa to do an arts course with them. They were very curious. And at that point in time, when I got back to Nigeria, I knew that I could relate to the artist very well. And one I could relate to, I started working with him, promoting his works, just like the other masters, Bruce Onomakwe, Grillo, and others. From that moment, I could work with him. And that was how the journey into the future started up till today.
And what a beautiful journey too. I mean, I love the way the discussion has taken us round from the spark of interest and going on to you getting more exposure and then coming to where you have had to do more research and training to really be in a position. And that is a classic story of growing up in this industry, basically. Because a lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of work that comes into it. Even if you have that spark of interest at the beginning, there's still so much that needs to be done because a lot of our people are pioneers in the art world in Nigeria and in Africa, as a matter of fact, which came up around that period of colonization. They were trained by white people, and then they had to interrogate their environment and decide what was there and what they needed to take forward. And then also use the new techniques they had learned from the Western world there. And a lot of them now went out just like you had done. At some point, I had a discussion with Dimas Nwoko, had a discussion with Bruce Onomakwe. They decided that having done what they did, having gone back to interrogate their environment, they now needed to go to the Western world. And so they decided where they would go. It's planned between them. And they weren't interested in going to America at that time because they thought the culture was entrenched in Europe. Dimasnoko decided to go to France, Keke decided to go to Germany. At some point, Bruce Onababeya went to the US. It's a classic story. I'm happy that, that we can get that directly from you. And now, having moved from there as a trustee of the Visual Arts Society of Nigeria, what initiatives or projects are you involved in to promote and support the visual arts community in Nigeria, aside fitting into that gap of galleries at that time?
Incidentally, Visual Arts Society of Nigeria is defunct today. I'll tell you its origin. You probably know architect Akison, Ibare Akison.
Yes, I do.
Who is a top member, one of the trustees, I believe, of Musical Society of Nigeria, whom I met at a point in time, going to Muson for events or so, or through family connections. And he called me one day and said, can I develop a blueprint that will duplicate Musical Society of Nigeria in a visual form? And I told him I could make an attempt. So I developed a blueprint, a document, which was fashioned as basis for something like Musical Society of Nigeria with its own premises, for public display and things like that. I produced that document, and it was to promote visual art in the same manner Musical Society of Nigeria is still promoting music up to today. It was presented. When I finished developing the document, we approached both architect Akison and myself. We approached late Mr. Samuel Lagbaju, whom very well, one of foremost Nigerian art collectors. We thought at that time he was the right person who could buy into the idea of a major project like that and see it develop into reality. But unfortunately, looking back today, the project was not started with the kind of artists, corporate entities. We started very well, but it lacked the vision and the passion. It needed very badly to start such a major project at that time and see it germinate, grow, and develop into a reality. That was what Mr. Lagbaju never lacked. And over a period of years, the whole idea just went, and we couldn't move forward anymore. And people lost interest. And in Nigeria, as we discussed earlier on Salma, there were too many things one would be contending with that will easily distract you. That was how that project died, which is very unfortunate because it was a project that was conceived in such a manner that would have taken visual art to international level and project Nigerian modern and contemporary art to the world stage.
In a more structured way, right? Especially for young up-and-coming artists. So do you still see a role for a VASCO today?
Yeah, I've heard that another group called the Collecting Society has come onto the scene, and I'm not involved in any way, but I believe they're trying to do exactly what Vason tried to do. As in Nigeria, people are ready to do anything to promote an idea. You will never have a shortage of ideas and visions in Nigeria, people trying to attempt to do one thing or the other.
Can you give us a kind of idea, kind of summary of exactly what Vasco was trying to do? Because like the issue of the galleries, it was very clear that niche had not been utilized at all when you moved in. Now for Vasco, do you have an idea of the plan you had at that time?
Yes, we were already looking for premises around Lagos Island. We went as far as that point in the project. Of course, late Mr. Olagbaju, Yemisi Shilon, Chief Gbadamosi, who were involved, who were trustees at that time. I mean, these were people of great influences in the society. And they had started looking for premises at that time. But like I said, something happened. The vision and the passion died in the process. And I and architect Ibare Akinson and Yemisi Shilon, years later, we tried to find out exactly what happened. And when I look back today, it was just because we didn't have the right kind of leadership. If we had had the kind of leadership that Musical Society of Nigeria had in people like Chief or Mr. Akintola Akison, the vision they had and their connections in the Nigerian society at that time, which was responsible for making Musical Society of Nigeria a reality, they were connected with the corporate world in Nigeria, the oil companies like Mobil, Shell, RG, and through their various individual practices, they were able to use their connections to bring in all these corporate entities like Mobil, Shell, RG, name it. They were able to make them key into their vision, to their dreams. And the structures like Salma today that were built in Musical Society were built as donations by the companies I've mentioned. You need, as a promoter of an idea, must leave that idea and vision to the point of a great passion that will convince others to key into it.
It would be interesting, for instance, to know what, if that had worked, how do you visualize Nigerian African art? What kind of positive mark would we have had that some of these plans had worked out?
I definitely believe it would have been a very good launch pad for Nigerian and African modern and contemporary and traditional arts. It would have been a very good launch pad because the things that ArtX is doing today, these are things, projects that Vason will have done, or ArtX or Lagos Biennale will have come in, they will have borrowed leaves from Visual Art Society of Nigeria. They will have keyed into what Vason was meant to do. And then will have created an earlier solid platform to project Nigerian and African art to the stage of world art much, much earlier.
Yes, I am getting your point. Also, projecting it from this end and not depending so much, because even while that was going on, different countries were picking up African arts as their focus and dropping it as they went along, up to the extent that at some point, probably in the 90s, most of the institutions were no longer quite focused on African arts. They came and went, and then at some point again, the thing came up, and then the auction houses came in, and then they developed specific channels for African arts. But what you're saying is that we could have done it from here instead of it coming from the outside, which would have been much more effective.
Definitely. In fact, to confirm what you had said earlier on, at that time, we had cultural departments of major embassies in Nigeria, like the Italian Cultural Institute at that time, which was being administered by a Mr. Gabriele Tombini at that time. And then you had also the British Council, but the very, very active ones were the Italian Cultural Institute, the Russian Cultural Institute, but at the forefront at that time was the Italian Cultural Institute, because in the 80s and to the 90s, as they had the 1988 show called Treasures of Asele for Your Late Father. This Tombini was very, very influential at that time as to what was happening on the art scene. The Italian Cultural Institute was the one that became a vehicle that, for instance, the Nsukka School of Art, which your father was the leader of, was the one that really projected the Nsukka School, which was founded by your father. So they also played a role. But after some time, I think by the mid-90s, their interest had waned. Tombini had left the country, and those who were organizing such shows by the cultural departments of these embassies had left the country. And that was how their contribution waned.
So the things were in flux all the time, but there was always something happening, and there were great collectors collecting. There were great artists who just kept working and working together. And during that time as well, the galleries, because that was the big gap, the galleries were starting to establish themselves in Nigeria to play their role. And I'd love to hear, Prince Odimayo, about your gallery, Treasure House Fine Arts in Lagos. Would you tell us a bit about what makes your gallery unique?
I started, like my other colleagues, with contemporary modern, promoting them, doing shows for various artists at that time. Especially, I was more interested in the masters, people like having worked with Benewon, met him very early in my career. I was very interested in the masters and other artists, up and coming artists. I was also very, very interested. And like other exhibitions, other galleries at that time, we were holding exhibitions. And in terms of generation, from the early 80s, we were the first set of galleries to emerge from the 80s and 90s. And I also, like others, we were more or less taking art to the people at that time. There were no infrastructures at all. We had to do everything by ourselves. People were not aware about the cultural benefits of visual art at that time. We more or less, we had friends in the corporate world because, as I told you, we were also in the corporate world. So we had friends who didn't know anything about visual art at that time. So we had to take art to them, organize exhibitions. Either we started with salon exhibitions in homes of some of our early patrons, on the island, exhibitions that will run for weekends or holiday periods, more like testing the ground as to whether this interest we develop will go into something more serious. When I look back today, it was a period of transition when we got involved with something we didn't know much about. We had a transition period before the physical galleries were established. And I worked mainly, at that time, I worked mainly with the old masters, as I said earlier on, and the young masters as well. And then along the way too, I strayed into traditional African arts, carvings, Ife works, Benin, and Yoruba traditional works, which was a very, very difficult area of art because we're talking about ancient works. I opened my gallery on Awolowo Road in Ikoyi, and I operated it for about 7 years before, due to a major health challenge in my life, and I'm still dealing with it up till now, I then started consulting and advising people and a lot from the background. And that's what I'm doing today. I'm mainly still advising people about what to do with their art, helping them to document their collections, whether it's traditional art or contemporary and modern. It's a situation when we all had, those pioneers, we all had to do all sorts of things by ourselves until more galleries came in. And from what I heard today, there are maybe about between 30 to over 40 galleries of modern art today in Lagos alone. But my focus has changed, and I must tell you this, that I got more interested in traditional art, again, which is an area which nothing has been happening about because it's very difficult to work with traditional art. You also have to develop expertise in it. You have to develop yourself as to how to identify pieces without having laboratories in where you can test objects, either in terracotta or wood or metal. But my focus has shifted to mainly consulting today. And
listening to you is really, really, really quite interesting because I remember some of the things that my father had mentioned to me. Following your discussion now, obviously at that time, the pioneers, starting from maybe Ben and Wanwa, I don't know if there are people ahead of him, but if they were, there won't be so many because we're talking about those that had gone to that Zaria school. He was one of the elder ones. But starting from that point, they were taught and trained by white people, and then they needed to project African art, and they also needed to create the opportunity for younger people that wanted to go into that field, because there was no such thing at that time. Most parents would not even think that children should go and study art. It wasn't even something that anybody would think about. But I see that you have always come in when you notice that there's a gap. And so they did all these things, and then they had the support of the West. During colonization and a little bit after colonization, it was people that actually came to train right here. And after that, it was those institutes, like you said, the embassies, their cultural sections. The different embassies came up at different times, depending on their focus. There was a Gothe, there was the Italian embassy, the German embassy, the Italian embassy. At some point, the US people came up, the French. So it kept going like that, rising and falling. But naturally, the people that could benefit from it the most were like the masters. And so if we needed to filter down further, then we needed those galleries. Because I remember that last year, I went for an exhibition in one gallery. It was somebody, an artist, that had invited me for an exhibition of his. He's not even in the country. And I went and I noticed, that at your time, nobody will even think of running a gallery as a viable business. And we're talking about people that are not in any way in the arts, but now they consider that they can take up that business line and promote with artists that they work with. And this way, a lot of younger artists are getting their time in the sun. I just wanted to mention that because these are some of the things that those early galleries managed to achieve. And today, there's a proliferation of galleries in that space. And so now you're going into traditional arts. You're also a prince. And I wonder what becoming a prince through your father's appointment as a ruler in 1978 and the unique aspect of your life has, what role it has played in your journey in art.
Traditional art, of course, is our early form of art. Whether you're talking about knock, which is the earliest form of traditional art, Africa south of the Sahara, or you're talking about Benin, the various other tribes, Yoruba tribe and Igbo, it happened with the journey with contemporary. One discovered that there was always a vacuum. And then don't forget that traditional African art had reached Europe in the 19th century through colonialism and missionary work. And so they've been exposed to European audiences over a period of time. So African art subsequently will be of interest to everybody around the world because, it's acknowledged today that life started on the continent of Africa. So invariably, the earliest form of art will be of interest to humanity. And that's what has happened today. From traditional African art, people now have developed interest in modern and contemporary African art. I believe it's something that had to happen naturally because if you stumble in something, your instinct will drive you, will propel you to dig deep into that endeavor. And that's what happened with me and my late brother. We just naturally drifted into it because some art dealers around the country were bringing carvings to us at that time. And as they were bringing carvings, which were mainly reproductions to us, they started bringing in original, authentic carvings as well. We didn't know anything about them. We were not schooled at all. My own knowledge had to do with European art, but we were forced by circumstances to start looking at those objects they were bringing. And we invariably schooled ourselves by talking to the dealers who brought the pieces to us, and then subsequently educating ourselves by buying books, written mainly by Europeans on traditional African art. And again, it was something we had to do by ourselves. And by reading our books, reading auction catalogs of Sotheby's, Bonhams, and Phillips, we got more interested. We realized that these heirlooms, objects that have been taken away from Africa, we realized that contrary to the impression that was given originally, that those objects were demonic or fetish, we discovered that that's where our true value as a people, as Africans, actually must lie. And that's what my late brother and I discovered. And by 2005, we actually had progressed to the point that MUSON, Musical Society of Nigeria, approached my brother and I and asked us whether we could do a collaboration with them. And we did an exhibition in 2005, and the title was Traditional Arts in the Collection of Oladele Odimayo. And it's documented. I still have catalogs, of that show. And that's how we started the journey with traditional art. It's definitely a much, much slower journey than modern and contemporary. That's what we have discovered. But again, it's apart from the national Commission for Museums and Monuments. Unlike modern and contemporary, into which people are straying now, in droves, it's difficult for people to stray into traditional arts because it's a very difficult area, very difficult. You must have expertise to be able to. But it's something to do because, like everything in Nigeria and Africa, we must do it ourselves so that we can recognize who we truly are and where we are coming from on this journey so that we can discover where we're going.
When you got more acquainted with more masters, did you, by any chance, discover that a lot of them had also had to go back to that interrogation to be able to come up with their modern form of art?
Yeah, I did. Especially with people like Demasumoko, Bruce Onobakwea, Yusuf Grillo, and lately of your father, his art in development, a Nigerian perspective. He talks a lot about all the art forms, African and Nigerian art forms, both traditional, contemporary, and modern. I mean, whenever I visited late Yusuf, I saw his collection of Ibeji figurines, twin figures, in the foyer of his house in those days. So I knew they were interrogating these things. I read The Little Prince. I read it recently. And it was a very, very fascinating story. And you know that all these Zaria rebels, people of your father's generation, movement from 1957 up to the time they graduated in the early 60s, they had stumbled on all these objects even before they got to Zaria. And definitely, as it happened mainly with your father, Bruce Onobakwea, their later influences or works became reflected in traditional Nigerian art. I mean, we know, for instance, that Dr. Bruce, his work is basically rooted in the Urobo tradition and culture. We know that today. And the same thing for your father, who would distill his philosophy of natural synthesis into Uli, which became the main curriculum of the Nsukka School from 1970-71, when he got to Nsukka, up to the time he left in 1986.
I'm wondering, were you able to harness those things at that time? If you knew of those things around that period when you were starting to go into traditional art, for instance, and you were able to leverage it, or there was an aspect of it that was unique to your own journey?
What happened was that from Grillo and Bruce Onobakwea that I've mentioned, I had read about the collections of people like Ulibaya that you've mentioned. And it was Ulibaya in the 60s, actually, who started the intense collection of traditional Nigerian art. It was the intense in which he was collecting and shipping them abroad that people like Wole Soyinka, John Pepper Clark, and Ebon Clark saw and emulated. They were or are the early collectors of traditional Nigerian art up till today. I'm aware that, although I haven't seen it, but I'm aware that Wole Soyinka has been building up his collection since the 60s up till today. The Clarks, both John Pepper Clark and Ebon Clark, actually saw their collection in Lagos. They also have another collection, I'm told, in the village. As I said earlier on, Nigerians, they were very skeptical because of what the missionaries told us, that collecting art objects was demonic and fetish, which was a deceit, because from that misinformation, what has happened today, that it was even difficult promoting modern and contemporary because of these false narratives that our people had heard from the missionaries who came into Africa, who were telling them, destroy your carvings, and at the same time going behind to take some of the most valuable pieces and taking them to Europe, which are in the museums today. So for me, there wasn't anything to, but myself and my late brother, we were convinced we were doing the right thing to build a collection of traditional art pieces in Nigeria, and at great cost, to pioneer the re-education of our people about the values of our traditional art. And that's where I am today. Unfortunately, my brother passed away, before we could achieve much. He passed away in 2017. So our dream has not been realized up to date. But what I'm working on at this moment is to talk to as many young gallery owners. And that's the point I am today. Talk to them about, get them to come around to my place and see some of these pieces. It's going to be a difficult, arduous journey, because there has been a lot of confusion through misinformation about what African art truly stands for, and the values and the inherent values in them. I mean, 40 years into the journey, the education is still going on. But I know that at a point, people will turn around to come and appreciate the objects are in the National Museum and probably in some private collections like Professor Shoyinka's collection or the Ebon Clark's collection.
This is such an important point you make, Prince Odimayo, this connection between tradition and the access to those traditional artworks and objects and the current and the present. I spent 3 days of last week at a conference called Reimagining Heritage Archives and Museums. And a whole day of that conference was dedicated to this topic of repatriation and restitution around these pieces of art that have been lingering in European museums and not part of the memory of the people where they come from. And that kind of loss of memory, what you're doing, revitalizing that memory actually, is so important, not just for kind of healing of the past, but also shaping the future. From your perspective, what sort of trends do you see shaping the future of the Nigerian art scene, especially around this connection between tradition or past and youth and the future?
In any story or any endeavor, the origin and the foundation are usually very critical. We've been working on modern and contemporary for 40 years now. It was a difficult journey, I must say, from the early 80s up to today. But our people are very impressionable. When you sit people down, Nigerians especially, they would listen. They would listen because this was how it happened with modern and contemporary. What I believe is that it will take some time, but the tragedy is that the most valuable pieces are no longer in Africa. They are no longer in Nigeria. They're all in Europe now. This debate, which you've just mentioned, is going on right now. Like most things in the relationship between the third world and the Western world, these best pieces will be difficult to bring back to Africa because of world politics. The one that is most current right now is the bronze debate of Benin, about 8,000 to 10,000 objects that were taken since 1897 during the Benin Punitive Exhibition. How do you get those pieces back? The Western world won't let go. They've promoted them since they left the shores of Africa. They've developed into what they are today. Objects that can be auctioned by Sotheby's, Christie's, and Bonhams. They have built the value system for them. Will they allow the value system, which they have built up over the period of time, will they yield this system back to Africa? It's a question I can't answer. But if I have to answer it, I can't see them returning the object. I can't. My own slogan right now is to get as many young gallery owners, collectors, to believe that whatever remains now in Nigeria, whatever still remains, must be trapped inside Nigeria rather than trafficked abroad. Get these young collectors who have the cash from oil and gas, from banking, to open their eyes, read up bulletins from galleries and museums abroad, sense the value of these objects, and begin to have a rethink as to what can be done to keep the remaining pieces back in Africa, especially Nigeria, that has most of these objects, either above ground or underground.
And expose young artists to them so that they can, like Uche Okeke did and the other great masters, so that interrogation can happen again between past and present.
Even with the trajectory of modern and contemporary art right now, there's still a missing link. And the missing link is traditional art, which is the foundation, the origin of our art is the foundation. And when the foundation is missing or the origin is missing, there will perpetually be a missing link. There will be. People like the masters we mentioned earlier on, They've used the philosophy of natural synthesis. They've espoused them in their works and in their lives. People like Elenatsui, a lot of his art, derives from his Ghanaian background. I have this theory that if Salma's father, Uche, hadn't brought Elenatsui here to Nigeria, where he has spent about 35 years of his productive life, Elenatsui would not be who he is today. It's in a paper which I wrote on Uche Okeke recently, which Salma and Ijoma, they have. It wouldn't have happened. It happened because Uche Okeke was who he was. Not only a visionary, he was a child prodigy.
You've spoken about this place that you've come to, this kind of legacy that you hope to leave, and this impact that you're hoping to make on the Nigerian art landscape. And you've been involved in the art community for a significant period and spoken about Uche Okeke and the living legacy that he has left. What advice would you give to individuals and organizations or even future artists in carrying forward the legacies of great artists like Uche Okeke for the benefit of future generations?
We need to have a lot more people who can develop dreams and visions, which will translate into realities. In the paper I talked about, which Uche Okeke and Salma for a new publication. In that paper, I said words to the effect that I believe that especially the tertiary educational system in Nigeria, if it can be resuscitated and revived, a lot of intellectuals in the universities must go back and study the works of Uche Okeke, Yusuf Grillo, and the so-called Nigerian. They have to research them, do more theses and dissertations on them. I'm talking about serious works, just like the Europeans and the Americans have done over years. A lot of the publications about our own art have been written by Europeans from their own perspectives, a lot of which are wrong. You cannot be the authority and expert over somebody else's culture and arts. It's not possible. It's the people must own their arts, culture, and civilization themselves and realize what it is, no matter how it's been badly bastardized or misinformed. The people themselves must come to that realization that this is our arts, culture, this is our essence, this is about us, and begin to rethink, no matter how difficult it is, about what to do to move into the future. I've told Salma, if people don't go back to interrogate the Zaria rebels properly, find out who they were, and then take off from that point, we need to go back. Many things have convinced me about who they were. They were taught by whites people. They were taught by they had white teachers. But fortunately, virtually all of them had one thing to do with the arts of their people before they got to Zaria. So they were never misinformed. And what did they do? They fused the Western ideas of art and technique with what they had encountered back in their villages. Onobrakwea, Chiefashiri, Yusuf Grillo, all of them. By the time they got to Zaria, for them, they brought with them the very critical knowledge of the arts and culture of their various people. So when they got to Zaria, it wasn't a matter of learning just about Western art. They already had been schooled in the arts and culture of their people, which is what brought them together, and which is what Uche Okeke said in Art in Development. It's such documents people must use in schools, especially at university level, to re-educate our artists, our intellectuals, so that they can discover the way forward.
Thank you so much, sir. It has been a wonderful session with you. Thank you for gracing this occasion, for the effort you have made, come from a very long distance to be able to participate in this. It just goes to show the kind of passion that you continue to have for this sector. A journey of 40 years, and it's still going on. I just came back from the Hamatan workshop in Abarot, and that journey that you started 40 years ago is still ongoing with these pioneers. There's, like you said, a continuous need to continue educating the generations that come. Yes, in their time, they were able to impact directly, and their followers were able to continue passing on the message. But as time goes on, it gets watered down. And there's always that need to continue to reinforce the information with new people that possibly never even met these pioneers, even if they've heard of them from a distance. I went there and I was participating with a group of people that are not professionals, they're not professional artists, but they are creatives in their own right, and they have the interest to come and learn more, to come and be mentored. And so they are coming with a clean slate altogether. The interest being there, but the information needs to be reinforced continuously. I also observed this thing you mentioned about the artifacts, because having lived with one of the pioneers all my life and seeing how they kept interrogating the past, honestly, it didn't occur to me that there will be people that are in that sector or that are interested in that sector that consider such materials as possibly blasphemous or something. But just from the Hamatan workshop itself, I met a young lady that studied art. She went off in other directions, but she always still been interested in art. And so she came back. And that is why she was coming for the workshop for the first time. And she did have some challenges with the artifacts from that angle of, was it done right morally or not, according to her. And I also helped in educating her that it has nothing to do with that. This is art. And that is how we practice art in the past. So I have come firsthand with this kind of expression that I never knew. And it's just a recent experience I never knew was even really there for someone that has studied and they have tried to educate the person and they have learned from these masters. So there is that gap. And that is why even with the Uche Okeke legacy, after his demise, with myself and Ijoma Uche Okeke, we thought to find out how do these visions, how do they resonate today with people that never knew about it in the past? The people, young people, generations of people that are just coming into the art. How does it resonate with them? And I totally agree with you that education is still very important. That bridging that gap is still very important. On the other hand, I've also been privileged to see what has happened in the sector of the galleries. It started happening in my father's time, but this was completely engineered by other people altogether because they were artists. He always said it's a very large sector with space for so many people to come in. So I like how the people in art management, collection of art within Nigeria, they've gone so far. I went for exhibition of Dotun Suleiman's collection, part of his collection. I was speaking with you about his art collection that you had started documenting, but you didn't finish documenting before he died recently. There's so much happening, and that is only happening because more and more hands have come on deck, and it is very important. And there's still a lot of room for more people to come to make this sector even more vibrant and to make it even more valuable and to pass the message we want to pass across to everybody. Thank you very much for your part in it.
The most famous Nigerian carver was one artist called Olowe of Ise, Ekiti. And Olowe lived between 1875 and 1938. His work is documented through the effort of one Rosalind Adele Walker, who is an American, who in her younger days was sent to Nigeria to do a field research. And through that research she did, a book was published on Olowe titled Olowe, Sculptor to Kings. That's the only known publication on that particular artist. The other things you hear about African carvers or Nigerian carvers, you get only from books written by Europeans. But to reinforce what I had said earlier on, something shocking happened. By one stroke of fortune, an Ekiti man, a politician, got to know about the story of Olowe and approached the Ekiti state government that this greatest Yoruba carver, who is known outside Africa as a great master artist, died a pauper. His house in Ise, Ekiti, totally in ruins, and was able to talk sense to the Ekiti state governor about Olowe. And the governor went to Olowe's village, Ise, to see the premises of Olowe himself. Of course, he was shocked by what he saw there in ruins. Within the last few weeks, a lot of attention has been drawn to Olowe's works and Ekiti right now. The government has decided to build a museum around the house and studio where Olowe once lived and worked. A foundation has been formed in his name, Olowe Foundation now, and a board of trustees has been constituted, of which Yemisi Shilon is a member, Nike Okundaye is a member. And this project started before I got to know, because suddenly I started getting inquiries about Olowe's works, where they are and where to get them. I didn't know it has to do with this new project, which will now ensure that the legacy of Olowe is preserved in perpetuity. That cannot happen by accident. It's as a result of people developing interests in arts generally, from contemporary modern to traditional art. And I'm very sure that the project will take off and probably be executed. And all the remaining works of Olowe that are still trapped in palaces in Yoruba land in Nigeria will, instead of being trafficked abroad, will go to this new museum coming up. So there's always a ray of hope, but everything depends on the people themselves. We must discover ourselves or rediscover ourselves to know who we are, know our essence as a people, and fathom where we should head. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It has been a great conversation.
Thank you, Salma, and thank you, Prince Odimayo. It's been a delightful conversation with you today, both of you, and I think it's going to make a wonderful episode.